Hello, my friends, and welcome to Fishtory. I'm Alexander Williamson, and today we are going to be doing a deep dive into the topic of lasagna substrate. Yes, that's right, lasagna aquarium setups. That's when you have substrate of different materials with different properties, all serving as one ecosystem. That means less work and more natural ecology in your aquarium. The Earth is a beautiful lasagna of layers. It is a record over time of what has gone on, and it's also elements from time passed on, from bacteria, from animals, from plants, all of this in different layers. And everything we know of on Earth today has evolved in this system. And myself being an archaeologist, layers of deposition and the rules of deposition guide our entire profession, and might be why I've been so drawn to this style of aquarium. Now, I've kept just about every aquarium you can imagine, and if you want to know how to build a layered substrate aquarium, which is a long-lasting, very natural aquarium, trying to have as many of the natural ecosystems and processes and loops that exist out in a pond or in a river, and bringing those inside when practical, then go ahead, watch my first video on the topic, and I will show you how to build it in about 7.5 minutes of the video. Is me just saying, go get this, put it in this layer, and add this much of that in this order. And there's a few variations of it. Well, in this video, I want to teach you all of the fascinating and complex processes that you've never been told about in the aquarium, especially if you're new to the aquarium hobby. And when you know the full picture, you can decide how you want to keep your fish. I won't have to tell you anything, but I think that this system, or a deep substrate system, or perhaps an aquasoil system, will still appeal to you. I think you will understand why I also say aquasoil and not dirt. I have an entire video on that subject, and it must be stated before you get into doing a tank like this, that this sort of tank works best with small fish, anywhere from 1/2 inch to 2 or 3 inches, angelfish or crebensis, cichlids, rams, that kind of fish, tetras, rasboras, danios. That is what this works best with. Now, you can make a much larger tank and incorporate bigger fish and more of these processes, including more plants, deeper substrates, but for the most part, this is going to take care of most people's average home aquaria, up to 120 or 180 gallons, no problem. So let's get into this, and I must ask for your forgiveness in the fact that in this video, this is the science of the video. This is the meat and potatoes, and some of this may be information you already know. So I am going to briefly right now tell you the order in which we're going to do things, and I'll try to put timestamps on it. But first, we're going to talk about your average aquarium with gravel or sand and a filter, like a sponge filter, hang off the back filter, that kind of thing that probably a lot of us grew up with. I know that was my first aquarium. Actually, my first aquarium was a bowl of water with a goldfish in it. But the sins of the past need to stay there for now. We can talk about that later. Then we'll talk about a planted aquarium and what they generally teach you, or what you learn in videos online about that process. What you don't learn is a lot more that's going on: chemistry, ecology, and biology. And we will then reveal that and talk about the deep substrate planted tanks and the layered substrate planted tanks. And finally, we will get into the nuances of the system, of why I'm adding each layer and the purpose of that layer, and why it's the depth it is, the material it is. And then you can take all of this information and decide, you know what, that really makes sense, or you know what, I don't think that works for me. I have hard water. Why would I add any crushed coral at all to my system? That's going to make my TDS, my pH, all of that too high, and I think I want to add more carbon or more leaves, and that's going to bring that down. So all these sort of things are variables that will depend on you. But when you understand the science behind all of that, it will be easy choices to make, and it will also become clear why things like algae or spikes in ammonia or nitrates, or when you dig in the substrate and bad things happen to your aquarium, why these things happen. So I know it sounds a little bit redundant, but let's cover these subjects really quick, and then we'll get to the meat and potatoes of this lasagna method, which I must say is not my method. I did not invent it. It has been invented by Earth, and it has been replicated by fish keepers going way back into the 1800s. You can see aquariums that look like this, and over time, any aquarium, even if you just had a big tank full of sand, if you didn't clean it up, if you didn't clean up the fish waste, over time, you would start seeing a stratifying of the sand. And you do in deep substrate. You're counting on it. So let's jump in and get to that. But I just wanted to clear up, this isn't the Alex method. This is the method that I think makes the most sense to me. It reduces the amount of maintenance I need to do and water changes on my average community tank. That being said, if I had a big tank of carnivorous fish, or big aggressive cichlids, or cichlids that want really hard water and happen to eat plants, this wouldn't be the system I would pick. But it's great for the majority of the fish in the hobby. Alright, as we jump in and we start discussing the most simple style of fish keeping, we also must discuss what the nitrogen cycle is. Well, unfortunately, what most fish keepers, most viewers probably will know as the nitrogen cycle is actually only half of the nitrogen cycle. Yeah, you heard that right. There is a whole chunk of the cycle that makes it a cycle. Because if you think about it, in our aquarium, the way you're taught the nitrogen cycle, which is you add fish food, the fish food turns into ammonia, either through the fish digesting it or it rotting and becoming waste down at the bottom. Then you need to develop bacteria, either in your filter or on surfaces in the aquarium, but you need lots of surface area, and that's why we create filters with lots of surface area bunched up in fabric or beads or whatever filter media we are using. Well, then they have one type of bacteria that is taking your ammonia and turning it into nitrites. Now, ammonia is dangerous for fish, but plants actually like feeding from ammonia right at the root if they can. They don't want a ton of it, but they want a decent amount, and that's how they prefer to feed. So just file that away in your mind for now. But fish will die if exposed to ammonia. Even in low amounts, it will start to kill your fish and burn their gills as well. So we need to keep the thing that the plants want and the thing that the fish can't have but produce. We need to keep them apart, yet in the same system once you involve plants. So let's talk about the simplest form of tanks, where you're told the nitrogen system, the cycle, which isn't really a cycle, which is that your nitrogen added as food going through the fish, then the bacteria turns it into nitrites, then the nitrites get turned into nitrates, and then, well, that's not really a cycle, is it? That's a line, or half of a cycle, and then you need to do water changes. Well, sometimes you're told you can add plants, and the plants will actually eat and use that nitrogen, which is true. With the help of bacteria, they will do so. They will eat the nitrogen, the nitrites, nitrates, or ammonia, or ammonium, in any form they can get it. They feed both from the water and from their roots. However, most plants in our aquarium are going to be root feeders. Anything with a stem or a root system, other than the rhizome plants like Java moss or Java ferns or bulbitis, African water ferns and things like that, those live up in the water column and feed off whatever they can get out of the water column. However, anything like cryptocorns, sword plants, even bulb plants and lilies, any sort of stem plant, rotalas, ludwigias, pogostemons, they all feed from the roots, and they feed 9 or 10 times more efficiently from the roots. Now, that's not to say that some of them can't survive feeding from the leaves and the stem and the water line, but they prefer to feed at the roots, and they prefer to have some sort of ammonia. So, in your understanding of early fish keeping, when you first start, you know that you have to have that cycle. It takes a couple weeks for the bacteria to all settle in and colonize. and you want to keep your filter running so that there's surface area that has oxygenated water flowing through it and breaking down the ammonia, turning it into safer nitrite and then much safer nitrates. But at a certain level, the nitrates are still poisonous and harmful to your fish. People argue about which level is safe or how much you should have, but I prefer to run a system that mimics nature, in that I like a system that has anywhere from 1 or 2 parts per million up to 10 or 20 parts per million at the high end, meaning that's a very low nitrogen amount, and that keeps the stress on fish very low as well. So when you're talking about that first style of aquarium, you get the nitrogen cycle, but you only get the introduction to it. So here's the other chunk of it. In nature, in the wild, there is actually a whole other piece to this puzzle, which is that anything deep under the water, under the sand, is actually going to not have oxygen present. It only takes a couple inches, and then the oxygen dissipates. So deeper than a couple inches, it becomes what we call anoxic or aerobic or anaerobic. Those are the 3 terms, but we're going to stick with today anoxic and aerobic. Now, aerobic means it has oxygen, and anoxic means there is no oxygen in there. There's no free oxygen for your plants or critters or anything to access. There may still be water, which of course has oxygen in the molecule, but it is not available. It needs to be broken up by some sort of bacteria, subject for a different video. So, in this layer of no oxygen or very low oxygen, there is a whole different set of bacterias. And there is a bacteria that actually takes nitrogen out of the water in the form of nitrates, and through the way it digests it, it takes the nitrates and turns them back into nitrites. Then there's another bacteria, just like in the aquarium, that takes the nitrites and turns them into ammonia and ammonium, which is the gaseous form of ammonia. So, you actually have a process in which there's bacteria working with archaea and fungi also, and it's taking all that nitrate that you have in the water that settles as mulm and debris and dust at the bottom of your aquarium and works its way down into the substrate. If you have enough depth that it can get to a level where the oxygen is cut off from it, suddenly the cycle goes from one direction and it goes completely in reverse. Now, the outcome of this is a true cycle, in that from your substrate, you'll sometimes see bubbles in a mature tank, especially in a dirted tank or a soil tank. You'll see pockets of air bubbles, what look like air bubbles. Well, they're mostly actually carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and of course, nitrogen, specifically nitrous oxide. And so that is funny because it's laughing gas. It is what is coming out of your soil. Now, you may also get methane, or you may get hydrogen sulfide, different gases, and people worry about that, but let me alleviate any worries you have. Any of those gas bubbles or pockets, one, they're not big enough to cause a poisoning in your aquarium at the scale of an aquarium, and two, as they move through the water column, they actually move quick enough as a cohesive group of molecules or elements that they come to the surface and escape without leaving too much of a trace in the water behind. So they don't diffuse as tiny little bubbles or tiny micro gases. So the nitrogen returns to the atmosphere, hence how plants and animals and things have nitrogen that can be turned into ammonia in their food in the first place, because that food had to get the nitrogen somewhere, because a lot of what we are made of is hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, as well as carbon and water, but elementally, those are the things that we consist of, along with calcium very highly. All right. So, in that system, now that you understand what's going on in a deep substrate, that's what you see in things like deep substrate systems with sand beds, or when people build a really deep substrate with dirt, and then they put sand on top of it. Now, aquascapers learned a pretty cool trick, and they engineered little pellets of soil to actually have that same entire complex process of the full nitrogen cycle going on within the pellets. So those pellets, they start with a little bit of ammonia, nitrate, and nitrite in a clay or dense centered piece of the pellet that's also a clay that's rich in minerals and nutrients that your plants and fish, for that matter, are going to use. And then the outside is fluffier dirt or humus-like material, and that material is going to be oxygen-rich. It gets permeated by little bubbles of microscopic amounts of oxygen, and so the bacteria living on the outside of every single pellet, or for that matter, all the surface areas in your aquarium, actually are full of that aerobic bacteria. They're full of that bacteria that turns ammonia into nitrites and then into nitrates, which is what you wanted, right? Now, typically, you're doing water changes to get rid of the excess nitrates that build up over time, because for most people, they don't have enough plants to simply feed all of the nitrates or ammonia or nitrites to in the aquarium. However, if we allow that to enter into the root layer, like we were talking about, and get down into an area with low oxygen, or the anoxic layer, we can actually then start storing up ammonia and almost creating a root tab out of each of those pellets, or in a tank that's deep. So aquascapers have actually developed those pellets so that they are an anoxic center that's full of nutrients, and over time it stores more and more ammonia, slowly but surely. Some of it gets lost to gas, some of it gets turned into other compounds, but a lot of it gets stored in the pellet, and then your plant roots will go down there and they will break into it, and they will feed directly from that in small little doses at a time, which don't disrupt your aquarium's functionality because you're just releasing a little bit of ammonia. Now, in a deep substrate aquarium, you may end up with a big amount of dense silt or mulm that has a whole lot of ammonia or nitrates or nitrites in any step of that decomposition, as well as biologics that are not favorable to your fish or to your plants. And so if you disrupt that sand cap that is keeping all that stuff in there, you can end up basically poisoning your whole tank. Now, I don't like that, and nature doesn't really like that. And although it has happened in very, very rare occasions where gases are released from lake beds in large amounts and harm people and animals and things, it is very rare and usually involves volcanics and a whole bunch of complex other situations and conditions to be in place. So, let's get back to the topic of the aquascape tanks. They're great. They have those little pellets with the aqua soil, and they're using liquid fertilizers, and they're using root tabs so that they only need an inch, maybe half an inch or 2 inches, it's kind of up to them, of substrate for their plants to hold on to. Now, obviously, this isn't much, and so over time, they grab onto that, they crumble those little pellets, and the plants are now no longer able to feed very well. They just have a layer of dusty mulm that isn't anoxic. It actually still is inundated with oxygen. So yeah, there may be some nitrates in it, but basically it can only feed as good as it would be able to feed from the water column with excess nitrates. And for that matter, it's basically sharing that with the water column. So the water comes and goes out of that first few millimeters or inches of substrate, and it's going to exchange the nutrients and the chemicals and properties of it and dissolve it into the water. So that's also why we add things like additives, like crushed coral or leaves or charcoal. These can impact the pH of our water. So depending on if you have hard water, soft water, low KH, low GH, high KH or high GH, or if your pH is not where you want it, your alkalinity versus your acidity, these are all things that you put into your top layer of substrate or your second layer of substrate, and they can alter the chemistry because that water is shared. Now, if you go deep enough, that water doesn't get shared very much. That water is moving so slowly that it's like being squeezed through a bunch of sponges in a row, and the oxygen can't even hold on to the water molecules as little microbubbles, and they get left out. And you can see where this goes on because it creates what we call a rust line. So if you have a planted aquarium, you'll see the rust line where your bacteria is stuck, basically. The interface between your aerobic and your anoxic bacteria creates that rust line. So with all this knowledge, now you know that if you have a fishbowl and no filter, your tank is not doing anything for your fish. You're going to have to put fresh water in every single day. None of the nitrate process or nitrogen cycle is going on efficiently or even much at all. Now, the surface of glass, yes, it will have a little bit of bacteria, but the more porous and the more textured a surface is, microscopically speaking, the more area it has for bacteria to grow, including all the bacteria that's doing all those good things we want it to be doing. Now, there is the nitrogen cycle, but there's also cycles like the carbon cycle or the phosphate cycle, and these are also key for how our plants, our fish, and our water chemistry all function. I don't have time to get into it in this video, but all of this is part of the equation of why I add what I add into this layered aquarium method. And if we keep continuing up the row of complex fish keeping, the form of fish keeping which most of you know and are acquainted with is having a filter. You have a hang on the back, you have a sponge, you have a canister filter or an under gravel filter, and you are pulling that oxygenated water either through a filter media or a mesh or something that has a lot of surface area, either beads or some sort of material like a floss or acrylic or fabric, and then that bacteria is growing on it and it's doing its thing, and it's doing that first half of the nitrate cycle that you probably were taught is the only part of the nitrate cycle or nitrogen cycle. Well, you introduce plants, and obviously they can help reduce the nitrogen. If you want your plants to grow really good, then obviously you can add root tabs, you can add CO2, you can add higher lighting. All of these things are great, and they're really independent of whether you're using a substrate like this or not. However, if you don't have enough nutrients, it does no good to run CO2 or to have high light. You'll simply grow a bunch of algae because you've got all this extra stuff in the water. Likewise, if you never do water changes, and you don't have an ecosystem of little microorganisms and bacteria and fungi and all sorts of things that break down those excess nutrients, that metabolize them, that use them, and then those things in turn get eaten by bigger little worms or nematodes or little tiny microcrustaceans, and then say your snails or shrimp eat some of that, and then your fish eat that, well, then you actually have a true cycle. And that is what I like in the deep substrate and layered substrate tanks. As I said, if you're utilizing the anoxic part of this, you may just be doing the aquascaping thing, and that is for beauty. It is for looking really cool, and it only needs to last a year or 2 years, and that's really what they were concerned with when they designed it. Plus, then they can sell more of it in the long run. You can always add root tabs to that or to any ecosystem, but one, it's going to dissolve, and if you disrupt it too much, it can come up into the water column as a spike in nitrates or ammonia or whatever's in your tabs. And two, it's kind of putting a band-aid on the problem. Whereas you can actually get natural cycles going on so that things like the potassium from the fish food, the calcium from the shells, the wood that has cellulose and lignin and tannins and all sorts of other compounds in it, so that all of that is working its way through the ecosystem, becoming part of your substrate, and then staying in it until the plants use it, or until microorganisms use it, or until bacteria, fungi, or archaea use it. And that is what we are doing here. That's what this is all about. It's not about just the aesthetics of the tank. You do need to set aside about 3.5 to 4 inches minimally to get this process functioning fully. Now, in the diagram that I showed you, not all of it was necessary. Some of it was just my preference. The sand cap is necessary in deep substrate tanks where they are counting on the fish waste creating all of their ammonia and nutrients and energy for their plants, because it's toxic to the fish. So they need to get that anoxic layer, that oxygen-free layer. They need to get that cap or lid basically on the sewer that is that substrate. And then they need plants to, over time, reach down there. But with that system, you need to spend a year or two, unless you're adding root tabs or using aqua soil under all of it, to charge it, because sand or small pebbles, those are completely inert. They don't have any nutrients for your plants. Now, some sand, arguably, yes, it has calcium and some carbonate and silica, things like that. But for the most part, it is inert. I have a whole episode on it. So let's talk about why I'm putting the things in the order I'm putting them in. Now that you understand the biological thing and the fact that food is a whole separate element, I have a video called Feeding Your Fish so that they feed your plants, or feeding your plants through your fish. I'll link these helpful videos and about building a seasoned tank with a full ecological system of microorganisms. I will link those videos in the description or down in the comments. But now let's go through what's physically going on, why I did them in that order that I showed you guys, because you understand now the biological principles. Now we're going to talk more about the mechanics of how physics, Brownian motion, settling, and water, and plant roots and things pushing things out of the way, how they work, and just some little tweaks that I've done to this basic system to kind of optimize it so that I don't need to add any more fertilizers than is absolutely necessary. For me, I have to add a little bit of potassium, and sometimes I actually have to add nitrates. That's it. Those are the only two things, and usually it's just the potassium. That seems to be my limiting factor when I have a high light system on this layered or lasagna system. Alright, let's bring this show home. So, putting in the ingredients to a lasagna or substrate tank, the best thing you can do is you put down sand first. Now, this is sheerly for the point that you have rocks coming next. And because of that, you don't want to scratch the glass or have a pressure point pushing down on the glass hard with all that weight of the water and the sand and the rocks and the soil and all that. So, I like to put down just a ½ inch or even a ¼ inch, just a little padding of sand. And also this is going to be another area where it's kind of just a little refuge for a different density of water and substrate. The next layer, you can use rocks if you'd like, or you can use filter media bags, or you could use substrate. It's really all up to you. You could use a substrate like an aqua soil, or you could use actual dirt. Now, I prefer aqua soil because of that engineered property that it is charged with those nutrients that you need. It's kind of like buying the perfect mix of compost for your garden all ready to go. The only thing is, over time, like we talked about, those little spheres break down, and then the plants will no longer be feeding at the very top of the dirt from an anoxic layer. They'll have to reach farther down, and there'll need to be an anoxic layer somewhere deep down that's created by fine particles of mulm and debris that settles over months of time. So this is a process that takes some time, and that's why I like using the aqua soil. I like using a mix of 50% ADA Amazonia, which has ammonia and nitrites and nitrates at some degree, and then also I'll use 50% or some mix therein of fluval stratum, which has all the minerals and the clay structure that we talked about, surrounded by a softer dirt structure or a softer type of clay around the outside. So it will also over time do the anoxic thing, and it's actually pretty breaking information that this process can go on in an area as small of a volume as those little pellets. Now, anything smaller than about 2 millimeters is too small for that to occur, and you're not going to get any amount of it occurring in a pellet. So using the mid-size or larger size, the 3 to 5 millimeter pellets, is my preference. So you could use just those if you wanted. And at this point, if you added those and some root tabs, you'd be right where you were at with an Aquascape tank, and you just put it under where the plants are going to be. Everything else can be sand or whatever substrate you want to see. But if you're going to continue with this layering idea and you want that nice anoxic layer to form eventually, what you'll want to do is you'll want to build up your landscape with whatever shapes you want. So in this illustration, I used rocks because that's cheap and everyone has access to rocks. But I also love to use filter media bags with mesh screening on them, and fill those with either lava rock, which is very porous and will have all sorts of bacteria, both anoxic or in oxygen-rich water, taking over it. And you can also, put other things in there, like root tabs or charcoal or crushed coral or whatever it is you may want. You can put in those bags, and you can kind of play with, do you want it deep down in the substrate for later on where bacteria and snails and other things are kind of shifting everything around, and so it's kind of a reservoir, or do you want it up high where the plants can access it and the snails and things will churn it up quickly? Now, Malaysian trumpet snails, in my opinion, are the ideal snail for all of this because they burrow in in the night, and in the day they come back out and they feed. Well, while they do that, the friction of their shells and the sand and substrate, they actually drag with them debris. So they're bringing that mold down, and the rubbing against their shell and the moving on it also moves the bacteria around. It can inoculate new sections of bacteria, and it can open pockets of oxygen or bring things down into pockets that don't have oxygen. So once you've got this layer going and you've got things built the way you want, you've got your hardscape looking the way you want, whatever hills and valleys, and you can put in any little caves or tunnels, because it's just easier to do it during this process to leave the void now. Then you're going to go to the lava rock. And this is, in my opinion, key to what is unique about the lasagna method, which is you have a layer there that's bare minimum an inch in every spot, if not 2 or 3 inches. You can play with it, but I've found 2 inches works really well. So we're using a 1/4 inch of sand, whatever spacers to build high spots, and then we're putting the lava rock. If you can, get lava rock with the tiniest holes possible and really irregular shapes, but just filled with holes and really light. The red stuff works pretty well. Dark black lava rock will also work. You want it to be light, or ultramafic as they call it, because it also describes how it was formed in the earth during a volcanic eruption and how it cooled, which also hints at in the matrix of molecules that creates that stone. So we know that iron, magnesium, manganese, a little bit of zinc, and calcium are very common and in most lava rock, like that red lava rock or the matte black lava rocks. And that has to do with how viscous the lava was and what part of the earth's core or under the earth it came from. And no, that will not be used by your plants or by your animals or anything right away, but over time, bacteria, archaea, fungi, snails, shrimp, everything in your system will chip away at that. Your plants will chip away at that stone. It's a very soft stone at that point. It's very brittle. And say your plant roots start wrapping around it and trying to get the little nutrient pockets that are in it from the bacteria deposition that are there. Well, it breaks apart, and then the other particles of nutrients are there, and different bacteria are there, and soon you start getting banding layers over time, like you see in my aquariums, where you'll see different colors, and it's different elements, and it's sometimes even just different pH, and it's fascinating. It's different everywhere you go in the world, but in the US, lava rock is cheap, and it's affordable, and it has those nutrients that will be key. The only one we're really missing is sulfur. So we need to add something with sulfur, and that's why to my lava rock I like to sprinkle potash, which also has potassium and other things, but I add wood ash and carbon to that lava rock layer and let it all mix together. Now, there's many functions for carbon. It's also just a great media to grow oxygen-rich bacteria oxygen-loving bacteria on, and then if it becomes anoxic, the anoxic bacteria will simply take over. It's great for biofilms and things as well, and overall it just adds to the diversity and to the amount of habitat that's there for your micro ecosystem. So I like to use that. It also supports weight above it, anything like stones or rocks. It's rigid enough that it will support that, and it will also give little voids within the rock for little tiny creatures like shrimp or snails or baby worms or little critters that are in our ecosystem to survive in. Now, the layer above that is our active layer. And here you can put your root tabs if you're trying to supercharge everything and get it going right away. You'll have your aqua soil pellets. You could use dirt if you wanted to, but be aware it can compact over time. It also can be very muddy and cloudy, so if you're going to be digging in the tank, I don't advise it. And also, it may have a lot of organics left to break down, and rather than having those nutrients in a formula that's just right there for the taking, which is what you're paying for with those aqua soils and things, you have something that needs to still be broken down by bacteria, by worms, by other things over time to fully optimize its usage in our ecosystem. So Finishing off that layer is sand if you chose to use an ammonia, nitrate, and nitrite rich soil. So in that soil layer, I like to keep it 2 inches at least thick. Now, some places you might go down to 1 inch, but you can make it as deep as 3 or 4 inches. That's no problem either. You can make it as deep as you want, really. And that is where your plant roots are going to go. They'll anchor down into the rock layer, and they'll put their roots where they're feeding for nutrients with oxygen up in the aqua soil, and then until enough mold and breakdown of those pellets has occurred over time, those little pockets of ammonia and of nutrients that are in the center of the pellets will then be broken up, utilized by plant roots, bacteria, and other things in your aquarium's ecosystem, and then it will settle down into a denser layer of almost like a silt or mud and clay type consistency that's farther down and now sitting on top of the lava rocks, which also have voids where certain areas will have different consistencies. And it's that variation of consistency that leads to not having any one monolithic layer that is causing problems. One layer that goes bad, one layer that grows fungi or cyanobacteria. In my tanks, you'll notice, sure, there's cyanobacteria, there's algae, but they're only growing in like weird, kind of sponge painted looking patterns, and they don't go that far. So no one creature or one bacteria or cyanobacteria is monopolizing, is not becoming a monoculture in our aquarium. On top of this, if it was an active layer, you can add sand, just like the deep substrate aquariums suggest you do, just like the father fish method or a lot of capped wallstead tanks. You can either just wait a couple weeks for that top layer to soak into the water and do your water changes, and within 3 to 6 weeks at max, usually it's more like 3, it will be cycled. If you already have filter media, you can just jumpstart that cycle, and within a week or 2 max, it will be cycled and safe for fish and shrimp. Now, if you don't use that and you just use a layer of aqua soil that is like fluval stratum, you don't need the sand whatsoever. You can just leave it aqua soil, and you can also put in creatures right away, as long as you don't have any root tabs leaching any ammonia or nitrates or nitrites at high levels. So that is the basics of the system, and then you can customize it. If you want black sand, use black sand. If you want white sand, use white sand, or no sand, coarse sand. That stuff isn't as important as understanding the mechanisms of biology that are going on in this system over time, where you're getting that anoxic layer. And it's so important to know that what you put in your aquarium becomes your substrate. And unless you're removing whatever you put in as food or plants that die or leaves that float off and things like that, unless you remove all that all the time, daily, you're going to create mulm, a fluffy light layer on top of all of that, on top of your sand, on top of your soil or aqua soil, and it's going to work its way down into your substrate over time. Now, usually about a year in, the deep substrate tanks really hit their stride. These tanks, the lasagna tanks with the lava rock, I seem to see about 6 months to a year they peak, and they run great for 4 or 5 years total, and then they kind of plateau out at still putting out green plants, but you may not get quite as many bright colors, and that's when you may need to assess, am I lacking some sort of nutrient? Did I not stock that nutrient at the beginning for the bacteria that breaks down the other elements? And that's when you can get really nerdy about it and come back to this channel to learn more about each element, each cycle, and what's involved. All right, you guys, this was a long episode, and I want to thank you so much for lasting all the way through and sticking with me. You guys are true heroes in my mind for having a curious mind and for wanting to care for your fish and plants. I really appreciate it, and that's what makes this community so awesome surrounding this channel, and I can't do it without you guys. Members, you really allow me to spend the hours I do, the research I do, and talking to experts when I have no idea what the answer is. You guys allow all of that to go down. So thank you so much for your support. Also, super chatters and just people liking, watching, and sharing. that is just as important too. So thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day. And really, share this with a friend if they think they know the nitrogen cycle and you know now that there's a lot more to it. I appreciate that. It really does help. All right, guys, I will talk to you next time on Fishtory. Bye.